It's good to see all of you here this morning. I love my front row people. You look comfy here. And I'm happy to have all of you who tune in with us online as well. My name is Shirley Haugen, and today we are in Acts chapter 18. We're moving right along. Today we're going to be continuing to talk about Paul's missionary journey. He's still on his second missionary journey. And you know, Paul was traveling around. He was preaching the gospel. He was making disciples of Jesus and deepening the walk of his new believers who believed in Jesus. And so today we're going to be talking about Paul's time in the city of Corinth. Last week we were in Acts chapter 17 and we were talking about Paul's time in the city of Athens. And there was, you know, that experience in Athens was a little bit different for Paul. Paul, he liked to work as a team, and so he ended up being in Athens by himself. He didn't have Silas and Timothy with him yet. They're going to rejoin him soon enough. And also that was kind of a place where there were a lot of philosophers and academics, and it was a different audience than what he was used to. Paul usually liked to go to the synagogues and to preach in the Jewish synagogues. But in Athens, he had the unique opportunity to appear at the Areopagus, and he got to speak in front of the philosophers and the council there, and of course the academics of the day. We talked a lot about his message at the Areopagus last week, some of the good things and the bad things about it, and how it didn't seem like he had great results, but yet he did get some believers as a result of his time there and his message that he had there at the Areopagus. So when Paul left Athens, he traveled to another unique city, to the city of Corinth. And Corinth was remarkable, not in the way that Athens was. Corinth was remarkable because of its wickedness. Corinth was known for its prosperity and its cosmopolitan nature, but it was especially known for its sinfulness and its wickedness. Corinth was a major city in the Roman Empire. It was an important crossroads there where it was located. It was a crossroads of trade and travel. And again, it was notorious for its hedonism and its immorality. And you know, one commentator describes Corinth this way. It was a commercial center with two harbors and had long been a rival to its northern neighbor, Athens. Corinth was a city with a reputation for loose living and especially sexual immorality. In classical Greek, to act like a Corinthian meant to practice sexual morality, and a Corinthian companion meant a prostitute. This sexual immorality was permitted under the widely popular worship of Aphrodite, also known as Venus, the goddess of fertility and sexuality. And so Corinth sounds like it was kind of like our modern day city of Las Vegas, which is known as Sin City. You know, if you walk around Vegas, there are people handing out business cards for prostitutes everywhere. And the whole strip is littered with these prostitutes' business cards in Las Vegas. So I kind of get that, you know, in my mind, I think Corinth was maybe a little bit like Vegas back in the day. And so Paul knew that because people from all over the Roman Empire passed through the city of Corinth, he knew that this would be a great place to have a strong, thriving church. It could really have a lot of reach. It could impact lives all over the Roman Empire, because so many people came and traveled through that city. And so that's kind of the background of where Paul is. And Dave, if you will, I'll have you start us off by reading in Acts 18, just read verses 1 through 11. And we'll start with that part.
After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius has commanded all the Jews leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean, for now I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God whose house was next to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking, and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you. For I have many people in this city." And he settled there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them.
Thank you, Dave. So Paul had left Athens and traveled to the city of Corinth, and that would have been about a day's journey, probably by foot. Of course, if he had a car, he could have driven there in less than an hour. But Paul arrives in this wild and wicked city of Corinth. And when he arrived, Paul met Aquila and Priscilla. And, it says that Aquila and Priscilla had come to Corinth from Italy because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. And so one commentator talks about this historical reference about Claudius banning the Jews from Rome. It says the Roman historian Suetonius wrote that Claudius banished Jews from Rome because they were indulging in constant riots at the instigation of Christus. There have been many attempts to explain who Christus was, but a likely solution is that Suetonius referred to Jesus Christ. He kind of mashed the name Jesus Christ together. But writing some 70 years after the events had the names somewhat mixed up. It seems that the expulsion of the Jews had to do with dissension and disorder within the Jewish community of Rome, resulting from the introduction of Christianity into one or more of the synagogues of the city.
Suetonius is notoriously unreliable.
He is so this may not be, so when I read that, I was like, okay, if that is true, that's the reason that Claudius banned the Jews from Rome, I was just curious, how did Christianity get to Rome so fast? I mean, I don't know the answer.
Well, if they banned all the Jews that were opposed to Christianity, that only left the Christians
it
there.
said it banned all the Jews. Jews are Jews, regardless of whether
I wouldn't see the Romans as differentiating.
I don't think they would either.
No.
I think.
And Claudius is after Nero, and Nero had a great
So my thinking is that historically we know the Jews were banned, right? And we know that's biblical. We hear that from Luke, and we know that's the reason Aquila and Priscilla. Now, the reason for the ban might be confused, but I think because there may have been some new Christians that were causing a ruckus in the Jewish synagogues, that maybe that was a good excuse for them to get rid of the Jews. I don't know, but it did make me ponder, was Christianity already in Rome? Was that the reason that those Jews, that they used as an excuse to send the Jews out of Rome? I don't know, but you know what? I actually got out a timeline of the book of Acts. I was like, okay, is it possible that there could have been Christians in Rome already? First of all, yes, it's possible. Paul was probably not the only one out spreading the good news of Jesus. There could have been other people who had heard about Jesus and took that news to Rome. And, if you look at the timeline of the book of Acts, just to put things in perspective, Jesus' death, burial, and ascension took place in 29 AD. And then Paul's conversion took place, they think, around 35 or 36 AD. So that was the earliest that Paul could have been kind of spreading the news of Jesus. We know when Claudius was emperor of Rome. That's historical fact. That was from 41 to 54 AD. And we know that the first biblical convert in the continent of Europe was Lydia. Now, just because Lydia is the first one mentioned in the Bible doesn't mean that she was the first Christian in Europe. It's just the first one that we hear about.
It said, saying that she's the first convert, that would be a person from Europe who is converted to Christianity.
Exactly.
Some could have been, probably have already come from Asia Minor.
Exactly.
To go over.
And I wanted to point out something interesting. If you think about when Lydia would have been converted, so Paul's second missionary journey, they think was around 49 to 52 AD. Most of the scholars I was looking at said that they think that Paul was in Philippi around 50 AD. Now, you might have to go, maybe we're off a year or so, either way.
It's an approximation.
It's an approximation. So maybe around 50 AD, Paul is in Philippi. So that's probably the approximate time frame when Lydia was converted. And could news that started in Philippi have traveled to Rome already? One thing that I think is very interesting is that Philippi is actually located on what some refer to as the Roman road, the Via Egnatia. And so the Via Egnatia, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but this was a Roman road that the Romans built between 146 and 120 BC, before Christ. And this road was almost 700 miles long. It was named after the Roman senator Ignatius, who had the road built. The Via Egnatia was constructed to link a chain of Roman colonies that stretched west from the Adriatic Sea all the way east to Byzantium, which is modern day Istanbul, Turkey. And so this road, it would have been made of stones or cobblestones for the most part, but it was graded in such a way that people could walk along it, as well as carts and those types of things could roll along it as well.
It had multiple layers.
It did.
Just like
It did. It had multiple
just like
layers.
a modern road.
Yeah.
Like the
today.
That's
interstate.
why,
Yeah.
that's why Roman
Yeah.
roads
That's-
lasted.
Yeah, you can actually see pictures of it, and the pictures of it still show some sections of it with the old stones, and then there's newer sections where they've paved over it with modern day asphalt and things, so depending on where it is along the way. But the Via Egnatia ran through modern day countries of Albania, North Macedonia, Greece, and then of course the northeastern tip of Turkey, where Istanbul is. And that was part of the Roman province of Asia back in the day. And so Paul would have used this road on his second missionary journey when he went from Philippi to Thessalonica. He would have walked along this road. And so Philippi was on this road. So a lot of people traveled through there, people who were traveling to visit family or for business trade. And of course, it was used for military purposes as well. So it was a well-traveled road back in the day. And if you think about it, this road not only connected from Istanbul way over here to the coast of the Adriatic Sea, but look what's over here. Italy. There's the boot of Italy. So you could just take a one-day boat trip across the water, and you could be in the heel of the boot of Italy. And then from there was another Roman road called the Via Appia, which would take you from that coastal city was called Brindisi, all the way up to Rome. So it was about 500 miles from Philippi to the coastal city of Dyrrhachium, which is now called Durrës. So 500 miles. If you were to walk 500 miles, it really just depends on how fast you walked. If you took 2.7 miles a day, which is a slow pace, it could take you. Let's see. I figured this out. If you took a slow pace, you could do the 500 miles in anywhere from 25 days, which is fast, to 6 months of travel.
And that is not just level terrain, it's very.
Well, that road was actually supposed to be in pretty good condition. You're right, it wasn't level, but it was.
And
It was
also,
mountainous.
It wasn't like they had to machete their way through.
and also
Yeah.
we're talking about people who are much more used to
They were used to walking.
distances than the average American.
So,
Yeah.
so you might take a long time to travel that 500 miles from Philippi to the coast, and then it said it would take a week to sail across the Adriatic Sea to Italy, because even though it only took one day to sail it, they said the boats would usually take a week to load, or 3 days to load, a day to sail, and 3 more days to unload. So on average, if you were going to travel across there, it would take a week. And then there was another 355 miles to go from the coastal city of Brindisi here up to Rome. So, depending on how fast you walked, the entire trip, the 500 miles from Philippi to the coast, sailing across the Adriatic Sea, and then taking the walk to Rome, the entire trip would have taken anywhere from 50 days on the fast side, if you're fit, to 10 or 11 months if you are a little bit slower and pace yourself more. So if you think about it, it's possible that Paul and his converts could have news from them could have reached Rome within a reasonable amount of time. So we don't really know who brought Christianity to Rome, but it could have been there. It could have been the reason why Claudius had trouble among the Jews and used that as an excuse to get them all out of Rome. So because of that, Aquila and Priscilla are now in Corinth. And y'all, that is a divine thing that happened because God sent them to Corinth to be there for Paul. So God used Claudius's anti-Semitism or whatever it was. He used that to get his people where he wanted them to be so that they could be an encouragement and a help to Paul. And so one commentator says this about Priscilla. Priscilla is a diminutive form of Prissa, which is one of the great families of Rome. She was probably related to this family in some way. And had the mentions of this New Testament married couple, Priscilla's name is written first, which was unusual. So you get the idea that Priscilla may have been a woman of prominence from a very well-known Roman family, a woman of some influence. And so Paul, of course, he had a couple of things in common with them. You know, his friend Aquila, he was a fellow Jew. Now, we don't know if they were already Jesus followers or if Paul converted them, because Luke doesn't really tell us that. But I like to think Paul converted them, but we don't know. They may have already heard of Jesus some other way. And so he had the Jewish thing in common with them, but then he also had tent making in common with them.
Yep.
They had a trade in common. You know, Paul had learned tent making growing up in Tarsus. And so he knew how to work with leather and textiles. He was skilled at those types of things. And so Paul was able to work with them as a tent maker. And you know, Paul ended up also staying at the home of Aquila and Priscilla. So he worked with them, but they also ended up providing him a home, a place to live while he was in the city of Corinth. And so if you think about it, Paul's identity as a tent maker may have given him more opportunities to talk about Jesus. You know, he could talk to people during the work week, you know, and maybe he could slip in conversations about Jesus. So he wasn't limited to his conversations on the Sabbath in front of a Jewish audience.
Well, and it was like his tent making, you know, it's kind of cool too, because elsewhere, you know, it says, have a trade so that you're not a burden on the brethren.
Yeah.
So it was as though, like you're saying.
It gave him a way to provide for himself.
And then as you're suggesting now, given that, you know, he's out and about, so he's talking about this, that, and the other, and then he can mention Jesus incidentally, and then it becomes a paramount topic.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a lot of missionaries today who travel to foreign countries, and they have day jobs. They have a job of some sort. Maybe you might have somebody who's in China, and maybe they're teaching English as a second language, but really they're there to preach about Jesus. And you know, because of that, there's a term in the mission world, in the missionary world, a lot of times they refer to tent making. Mm-hmm. So whatever your job is when you go overseas to work and to be a missionary, you're a tent maker.
Yeah.
You're engaging in tent making, even though you might be a teacher or maybe you work in IT. Whatever your job is, people refer to it, oh, he's a tent maker in Uganda, or he's, you know, but he's not really a tent maker. There's really not that much of a demand for tents all around the world. But that's just kind of a term that the missionary world has coined because of this story in the Bible, which I think is interesting. And so I love how God provided Paul with these two new friends in Corinth. He's got Aquila and Priscilla. And you know, he made these two friends, if you think about it, he was still waiting for Silas and Timothy to join him. And so when he arrived in the city, he didn't have his close-knit team with him that he was used to having. And so it would have been nice meeting Aquila and Priscilla, so he had some partners there that he, somebody he could relate to and work with and live with. And of course, like I said, there's a possibility Paul converted them if they had not already heard and become believers in some other way. And so they became really good friends. And this began one of the most important friendships that's mentioned in the New Testament. In Romans 16, Paul called Aquila and Priscilla his fellow workers who had risked their own necks for my life. And that's Romans 16, 3 and 4. So Paul worked as a tent maker with his friends, but his real passion was telling others about Jesus. And so it says in verse 4, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, trying to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. Now, Paul later described the character of his bold preaching in Corinth in his first letter to the Corinthians. He said, for I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. We talked last week about how when Paul had spoken in front of the Areopagus, that maybe he didn't get as much time to explain about Jesus and the cross when he was talking to that audience as he wanted to. Because as soon as he started mentioning resurrection, they were like, they kind of tuned out. And so now it seems like Paul is really focusing on those basic truths of the Christian faith. And he really focused that Jesus is the Messiah. And he focused on preaching Jesus and the cross. And then it says Paul was finally rejoined by his friends Silas and Timothy. Verse 5 says, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. And we know that while Paul was in Corinth, he did get some financial support from Christians back in Philippi. We know that from 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And so when Silas and Timothy came, it seems like maybe some of that support, financial support, arrived with them, and he no longer had to rely on tent making to make a living. He had some other support from other Christians. And so he was able to concentrate more fully on the task of building the church there in Corinth once Silas and Timothy had joined him. And it seems like when they arrived, Paul is kind of reignited because he gets to focus more on what he really wants to do anyway. So when Timothy came, he brought news about how the Christians in Thessalonica were remaining steadfast in the faith. And 1 Thessalonians, the letter that Paul wrote to them later, we know that they brought Paul great joy. And that hearing that news of how they were doing really spurred him on in his ministry. And of course, Paul answered them back by writing his first letter to the Thessalonians while he was there in Corinth. That's where he penned that letter that we're all familiar with. So everything seemed to be going really well for Paul. He had made new friends. His old friends had rejoined him. So everything seems to be going well in the wicked city of Corinth. But then, of course, trouble starts brewing again. It says in verse 6, but when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. And so Paul had been preaching to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah that had been prophesied in their scriptures. And they didn't like it. They were opposing him. One translation says they opposed him and blasphemed. And so the blasphemy, if you think about it, that would have been directed at Jesus. So they were probably saying things about Jesus that was a blasphemy to him, to God. And, and Paul had really had enough of it. It was one thing if they wanted to oppose him, but when they blasphemed, Paul's like, I'm out of here. Paul, if you think about it, he was fulfilling what the spirit of what Jesus had said in Matthew 7:6. Do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under your feet and turn and tear you in pieces. And so when the people there were determined to reject the gospel, Paul didn't want to stay around and waste his time and breath on them anymore. And it says he shook out his clothes. You know, in verses before it said he shook the dust off his sandals. Well, now he's not just shaking the dust off his sandals. He's like, I'm shaking the dust off my garments too. He's like, I'm shaking my dust off. I'm getting out of here. And what's funny is that he leaves the Jewish synagogue and literally goes right next door. He didn't have to go far. I'm going to shake the dust off here and I'm going to go right next door, because right next door there was a man there that lived right next door. And let's see, verse 8 says that not all was lost on the Jews. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. And Crispus, the Jewish synagogue leader, think about that, and his family believed and they were baptized. So in spite of the fact that there had been this Jewish opposition in the synagogue, and he, shake the dust off of him, there was still some good that came out of that. And so what's interesting is that, everything, even though he decides to focus on the Gentiles, it does seem that his time and his work is productive, that he's getting results. People are coming to believe in Jesus. But in spite of all this, it appears that Paul may have been getting discouraged by those who rejected Jesus. Maybe it made him sad that he wasn't able to get through to all of his Jewish brothers. But we know that he may have had some discouragement or something going on, because look what God does in verse 9. God gives Paul some special encouragement in a vision one night. In verse 9 it says, "Do not be afraid, keep on speaking, do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city." So the implication here is that Paul was afraid. Paul was afraid. Maybe he was afraid of being persecuted.
Or beaten and left for dead.
Or stoned.
Lord knows he had been through a lot. He had been stripped. He had been stoned.
Shipwrecked,
He had been beaten. And so, we build Paul up as this hero of the faith, but Paul was human. And I can certainly understand why he might have been afraid.
Yeah.
Especially when he starts seeing opposition from his fellow Jews in the synagogue.
There's only so much pain a person can take.
Exactly. And so I'm sure he had some anxiety, that something bad was going to happen to him again. He could end up in prison again. I mean, that those things, those fears would have been, if we were him, those fears would have been running through our
And
minds.
to me, that's a good thing, because it shows how human Paul was. He was a giant of the faith.
He was.
But he still was human.
And so maybe he was weary and afraid, and maybe he was anxious, maybe he was a little beat down. Whatever it was, God reassured Paul that he should keep on speaking. Do not be silent. God assured Paul that he would be safe. He said, no one is going to attack or harm you. What a relief that would be. Because that's on his mind. He's probably always like watching his back to see who's coming after him. But God has promised him no one is going to attack and harm you. I have many people in this city. God not only has your back, but God's people have your back too. He has people who will help you. And so
that's reassuring even to me when it says, "For I have many people in this city." What was it, Elijah or one of the big prophets he was like having a bout of depression, hiding out, and he was complaining, "I am the only one, Lord." And he's like, "Are you kidding?" God's like, I got God.
It was
Elijah. And Elijah, and
Under the broom tree.
God's got his people.
Sometimes I think, when we see the horror in the news, just like Josh was speaking about this morning, and we see, strife and political anxiety and just all this mess, we can feel like, well, I'm the only one who speaks up. We can get that little martyr complex that, we're the only one. And I love that he tells that to Paul, because he's also telling it to us. Because I got many people in the city. And
I think that's God's way of saying you're not alone.
You're not alone.
Not only am I with you, but my people are with you too.
Well, and another thing about that kind of concept is sometimes you can get real discouraged about the youth of today or whatever. And my first year in BSF, I may have told this before, but we have a share night, the very last night of the year. And every year that we have a children's program, and some of the kids that have grown up in BSF under that tutelage, when they are seniors, they let them come and speak to the whole assembly. And when I heard those two, there were two senior young people, spoke with such boldness and authority on the Word of God, it just will reinforce the knowledge that He will always keep a remnant no matter.
God has his people. He does.
I got people.
You're not alone. There's other people close by. God's people.
I got guys. I got guys.
Yeah, the music this morning did speak to
I
that.
sought
Yeah,
the Lord, He heard.
yeah, and he answered. That's exactly right.
Well, another real quick one, when John the Baptist was in jail, he sent word to Jesus, said, "You are the Messiah," right?
Yeah.
Before they beheaded him. And like, am I doing this? Is there any reason to do this?
Yeah.
You know, and he was a hero of the faith.
And and he
Yeah.
needed that encouragement
Yeah.
that he was doing the right thing. And I love that God says, "For I am with you." Jesus said that in Matthew 28:20 at the end of his Great Commission before he went back up to heaven. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. And what a wonderful reminder that we are never alone. Did you know that God says these words in the Bible over 100 times in more than 100 different ways? From the first book of Genesis in Matthew 28:15, it says, "I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go." All the way to the last book of Revelation. Revelation 21 says, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God." So God promises us all through his word that he will never leave us. And God reminded Paul at this moment, when Paul must have really needed it, that he was with him. And so it says in verse 11 that Paul stayed in Corinth for 1.5 years, teaching them the word of God. And that's longer than he got to stay in any of those other cities that he had visited so far. In most of the cities, he got a few weeks probably at most, but he was able to stay here for 1.5 years. And then I know that the next few verses are not really part of our focal verses, but I want to just talk about them briefly. It's the story of Gallio. And it says, this is where the Jews of Corinth attempt, unsuccessfully, but they attempt to convict Paul before the civil authorities. It's like they're trying to shut Paul down through legal means. And starting in verse 12, it says, "When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. This man," they charged, "is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law." Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to them, "If you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things." So he drove them off. Then the crowd there turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the crowd, or in front of the proconsul. And Gallio showed no concern whatever.
I really don't understand why the Jews would go to a Roman proconsul believing that he would have anything to say about what's
Well,
going
it
on.
obviously backfired on them.
Yeah.
It backfired in a bad way.
I think that he
So,
would care.
it's funny because the Jewish authorities that were trying to shut Paul up, and I guess they couldn't figure out how to do it, so they tried to use the Roman law and the Roman authorities to help them. But it didn't work.
And
It didn't work.
And the Romans showed that
Gallio,
he was
he was having no part in this, and the crowd turned against Sosthenes. And if you think about it, Gallio, he was a wicked man. He does make a good decision. He basically says, "I'm staying out of that." We would have supported that decision. That was kind of like, freedom of religion. Like, hey, that's your religion. That's your religious matters. I'm not getting involved with that. So we would have respected that decision. But then it's kind of like Gallio, when the crowd gets riled up against Sosthenes, he just lets it happen, which means he's probably got a little anti-Semitism in him too, that he just lets them beat this Jewish leader right there in front of him, and he doesn't do anything to stop it. So he's kind of,
We don't know the whole story.
we don't. You're exactly right. But really, because of Gallio, Paul was able to continue preaching in Corinth and continue his work there. And then of course, really, we're going to get to the end of Paul's second missionary journey. And so I'm going to have you read our next set of verses in 18, and go all the way through 22.
Well, I want to say,
Yes.
I will, but I want to say, just a comment, that nothing has changed with the Jews, because Alex, our Messianic Jew, he said, when he did the Seder lunch, he said that you can't do a New Testament there. Last week in Raleigh, there was a gentleman there who was a missionary to the Jews, and he said that they refer to us, Christians, as Nazis, because we not only want to kill their bodies, because we want to more than kill their bodies, we want to destroy their faith. So nothing's really changed with the Jews as far as that goes. So anyway, so that's...
Well, and we know we don't want to kill them, and we don't want to destroy their faith either. To me, Christianity builds on their faith. It doesn't take it away.
It's a new covenant.
Yeah.
It is a new covenant.
So go ahead and read for us.
The old covenant promise that he made.
Yeah, and now we got the new covenant. Yes.
Yeah, so go ahead and read for us Acts 18 through 22.
Okay. Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria. And with him were Priscilla and Aquila. And in Caesarea he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. They came to Ephesus, and he left them there. Now he let himself enter the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent. But taking leave of them and saying, I will return to you again if God wills, he set sail for Ephesus.
Okay, and then go ahead and read 22.
Okay. When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and went down to Antioch.
Okay, I wanted to end there because it kind of ends his second missionary journey, more or less. So unlike previous cities that Paul had been in, Paul was able to stay a long time in Corinth, and he wasn't forced out. He got to leave of his own accord when he wanted to. So he stayed there, it says, a good while, fulfilling the promise the Lord made to him back in verses 9 and 10 when he encouraged him in that vision. And so Paul, while he was there, he developed this deep friendship and partnership with Aquila and Priscilla. And they decide to go with him when he leaves Corinth, and he headed east back toward Jerusalem and Antioch. We read an interesting detail here at the end of our verses, that before he sailed, Paul had his hair cut off because of a vow he had taken. And this vow was almost certainly the vow of a Nazirite. In number 6, it talks about this Nazirite vow. Usually this vow was taken for a certain period of time, and when completed, the hair, which had been allowed to grow freely during this time, the hair would be cut off and offered to the Lord at a special ceremony at the temple in Jerusalem. And so the purpose of this Nazirite vow was to express a unique consecration to God, promising to abstain from the fruit of the vine and not to cut one's hair and to never come near a dead body. And one commentator said this. It said, Paul's vow shows that Jewish opposition to his preaching had not made him anti-Jewish. He never forgot that he was Jewish. His Messiah was Jewish. His Christianity was Jewish.
That is untrue.
And the Old Testament rituals might still be used for good purpose. Apparently, though, Paul was adamant that Jewish ceremonies and rituals must not be required of the Gentiles, he saw nothing wrong with Jewish believers who wished to observe such ceremonies. So Paul did. He took this Nazirite vow, and that's when he was going back to Jerusalem. The scholars say that's what he was going there for. He had cut his hair, and he had it with him, and he was going to take it and present that as an offering in Jerusalem. So I love that Luke shares us that small detail. It's kind of mentioned almost in passing, but it does tell us that Paul never turned his back on his Jewish faith and heritage. He did not become anti-Jewish just because a lot of the Jewish people had turned against him and persecuted him. He still loved his Jewish brothers. And so now finally, after sailing back across the Aegean Sea, Paul finally arrives in Ephesus. And so I love that he finally gets there, because I don't know if y'all remember, but back at the start of his second missionary journey, Paul had wanted to go there. But remember, God had hindered him from going to Ephesus. God had sent him that that vision of the Macedonian man and sent him across to Macedonia, to a completely different continent, to the continent of Europe. And so now it was like Paul, God was saying, Paul, I know you want to go to Ephesus and you're going to get there eventually. And so now everything comes full circle. God does now allow Paul to go to Ephesus and to preach to the people, to the people there. And of course, when he gets in Ephesus, he has his friends Aquila and Priscilla with him there, so they could be there to help him. And so Paul arrived in Ephesus, and Paul did what Paul always did, which was he went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And so it says now, if you go a little further, it says that Paul did end up leaving Aquila and Priscilla for a little while because he wanted to make that trip back to Jerusalem. And you get the idea that he wanted them to stay there in Ephesus, and he had hopes to rejoin them at some point in the near future. And so Paul was going to head back to Jerusalem where he could present his hair offering as part of his Nazirite vow. And so something good had started there in Ephesus with Aquila and Priscilla, and Paul did want to rejoin them and continue in working with them at some time in the future, God willing. And so Paul went to Jerusalem, he did his thing, and then it says he left Jerusalem and returned to his home church in Syrian Antioch. And I can just imagine how pleased these people would have been to have Paul come and rejoin them, because he had probably been gone on missionary journeys for about 3 years or so, and he would have had a lot to catch them up on and what God was doing. Can you imagine the stories he would have to tell to all his friends and his brothers and sisters in Syrian Antioch? I mean, stories, good things, as well as all the bad things that had happened. And then, of course, our last verse for today that we read, verse 22, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church and then went down to Antioch, period. And this was the end of Paul's second missionary journey when he arrived back to his home church in Antioch. So verse 22 is the end of Paul's second missionary journey. But you know what's funny? Verse 23 starts Paul's third missionary journey. So Luke doesn't give us any time to catch our breath, and Paul was not getting any time to catch his breath either. Verse 22 ends the second, and verse 23 starts the third. And so to summarize all this, think about Paul had finally made it back to his home church and congregation, and I'm sure that would have been an amazing homecoming, and they had a lot to catch up on. The work that Paul had been doing all throughout his travels, all the good things, he would have been able to share the miracles and all the miraculous things that had happened along the way, as well as all the hardships and the persecutions and stuff that he had done. And so Paul is going to turn right around. He's going to start off again on his in verse 23. He's going to keep going. And I wonder how Paul had the energy to keep going.
Well, you said, would he be like 50 or 55 years old right now? Because you said 33 or something.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'd have to go back and look and see what his age was. But how did he do it? But I think it comes down to this. God brought Paul special people. He wasn't by himself. He had helpers in the faith. He had friends. He had his brothers and sisters in Christ. He had Aquila and Priscilla. He had Silas and Timothy. We could tell in this story today, when Silas and Timothy came to Corinth, it kind of really spurred Paul on. He was really more focused on preaching than he had been even before they got here. And then, of course, he develops these 2 new close friends while he was there. And so it just reminds me that God brought Paul special people, because God has many people in this city. Also, the Lord gave Paul a special word of encouragement when he needed it. Back in verses 9 and 10. You're not alone. Jesus is with you. We've got people on both sides of heaven that are cheering us on. Imagine when you read those words in verses 9 and 10. Imagine Jesus himself speaking those words to you.
I love it when there's red letter words in the Bible after he's already.
And he's gone. He's gone, but he's still speaking. He spoke to Paul here. Yeah.
Revelations all covered
Yeah.
in red too.
So this is the word of Jesus speaking to you, to us. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you. I have many people in this city. That's God saying everything's going to be okay. Just let those words sink in. Do not be afraid. I am with you. And that's our lesson. Great comments, you guys. Any other comments before we close in prayer?